Hello U.S. History students, and welcome to Unit 3, Lesson 4, Fighting World War I. Combatants in World War I quickly begin to use what we call total war tactics. And this means that not only are they using all the troops that they can use, or the soldiers that they can use, but they're also transitioning factories and shipyards and things like that to build things for the war. So in the United States, for example, we would take the Ford Motor Company plants where they're building cars and transition those to build tanks in later wars. So governments are committing their entire nation's resources to fighting the war effort, and the war industry literally takes over everything to try to help and win the war for the Allied powers. Soldiers were also drafted. This means that anybody between the ages of 18 and 35 would have to go fight in the war. Media begins to be censored, meaning you have people that are looking at everything that's printed, everything that's written, and things of that nature. And then we get propaganda, which is created at this time to help support the war effort by trying to convince people to help out. And propaganda, by definition, is information that's used to promote or to publicize a particular political cause or point of view. In this case, the political cause would be for the war effort. And the photos that are on your screen are good examples of what we would consider World War I propaganda. So your traditional, I want you for the U.S. Army, that is created during World War I to try to convince people to join the Army. You've also got the Spirit of 1917 as a means of joining the Marine Corps, and I'm doing my duty. Are you? Your Navy needs you this minute, as a means of trying to encourage people to join the branches of the military. The Air Force is not a branch of the military yet, and so we've really only got those three, and we're trying to get more and more people to enlist to try to get them, to join the military so that we can increase the numbers of people in our army. World War I is also a huge technological advancement war. We get new industrial weapons, such as handheld machine guns, airplanes, which are not used for bombing in World War I, they're used for spying. Blimps, which are those air-filled, funny-looking flying things, also used for spying. Heavy artillery, such as anti-aircraft weapons and things of that nature. Tanks, and as you can see on the side, World War I tanks don't look like the tanks that we're used to seeing today. We also see the rise of chemical warfare with poisonous gas such as chlorine, which would be launched into the trenches, and then if you did not have a gas mask, which were created to help combat the poisonous gas, your lungs would end up filling up with fluid and you would die. Flamethrowers, as well as submarines, are all new technologies that occurred during World War I that makes the fighting even more difficult for soldiers on both sides. These weapons lead to unprecedented casualty rates. Not only deaths, but also people who have to live with being disfigured or dismembered for the rest of their lives. As you can see in the photo in the top left, those people have lost their legs. People would lose arms. Some people's whole faces would be disfigured. And they would come home with what was then called shell shock, but now would be considered PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder because of the horrific things that they saw during the war. Trench warfare makes it extremely difficult for either side to gain an advantage or gain any ground, really. These were built to protect soldiers from enemy fire, and both sides built them. As you can see in our diagram here at the top, there were several layers to trenches. So you would have A, which would be the front layer of the trench, and this would be considered your front line trench. You've got B, which would be the support trench, where the support soldiers would be. C would be your reserve trench, is where the reserve soldiers would stay. And there are communication trenches that are like lines that are cut in between each level of trench to be able to allow for easier movement between the different layers. In the middle between the Allied trenches and the enemy trenches, there would be a place called no man's land. And this could be anywhere from 25 yards to a mile wide. And the reason it's called no man's land is because it's filled with landmines. There's nowhere for you to hide. So once you get into no man's land, you're pretty much an easy target for the enemy to shoot you. And they call it no man's land because really no man can survive there. And each side would dig these miles long across the French countryside. And because of this means of fighting, over the course of the war, the most land maybe that was gained was a couple of miles, because fighting was so difficult. Fighting on the Western Front of France slowed to what we call a stalemate. A stalemate is a situation where neither side can win. They can't gain an advantage. During this, 2 million soldiers were killed or wounded in just the battles of Verdun and the Somme. And those are only 2 of your major battles. We also see the rise of German U-boats, which are submarines, patrolling the Atlantic Ocean and attacking any ship that they thought might be carrying supplies from the United States to our allies in France and Great Britain to help them out. The battles lasted for, in some cases, months. Like Verdun lasts from February to July of 1916. And there's very little ground that is won in those several months. On the Eastern Front, because remember at this point, Russia is part of the Allied powers, and they're fighting on the eastern side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. So Germany and Austria-Hungary are fighting a two-front war. On the eastern side, the Russian army is really struggling to hold on against the German military. Russia is having a hard time producing enough weapons for their troops and ammunition, and they're having a hard time feeding their men. There's not a lot of support for the war effort, and they don't industrialize and mobilize the war effort like we do in the West. Millions of Russian soldiers and civilians die throughout the course of their small time within the war. And then by 1917, Russia is literally on the brink of collapse because of this war. In November of 1917, a man by the name of Vladimir Lenin and his group that he calls the Bolsheviks overthrow the Russian government by kidnapping the royal family and taking them to where it's very cold. It's called Siberia. And unfortunately kill them as a means of overthrowing the Russian government, and then establishes the Soviet Union, which is the first ever communist nation. So Germany is pretty much kicking Russia's butt. They don't really have any supplies. They don't have food. And Lenin sees this as the government's fault. The government's not helping the people. The government's not doing what's best for the people. And he calls for essentially revolution. Kidnaps and takes the Russian royal family to Siberia, kills them, and takes over the government. And this is why Russia leaves World War I, and the United States will eventually enter World War I. Within the same year, but before Russia pulls out. The U.S. remains neutral from 1914 to 1917, meaning we are going to help out our allies, we're sending supplies, but we do not actually get involved. But once Germany starts violating the free trade, when they start sinking our ships with American civilians on them, war is finally declared in April of 1917 when President Wilson asks Congress for permission to declare war. Congress then agrees. After America declares war in 1917, because of unrestricted submarine warfare and because of the Zimmerman telegram that we talked about in the last lesson, where Germany sent that telegram to Mexico telling them, hey, we're going to give you this land back if we win, if you help us out. But then Mexico never gets it. Great Britain intercepts it. Really, at this point, Americans agree that it's time to get involved. And the U.S. has to really mobilize before we can fight in Europe. We don't really have a very big military. We only have about 200,000 soldiers when we enter World War I, and we need a much larger military. We also need a lot more supplies. If we're going to help out and we're going to send troops, we need to arm them with the supplies that they need. So President Wilson and Congress create 5,000 bureaucratic agencies to manage and win the war. And this simply means that they create new agencies to help manage the war effort. So the U.S. supports the Allied powers, but America entered the war because of their own reasons. Wilson wants to keep the U.S. military separate from other Allied forces. And so in order to do this, they create the American Expeditionary Force, which was led by John J. Pershing, who is now known as one of the brightest military minds. And he turns these regular civilians into a very good fighting force over a matter of months. And those troops that he trains end up helping really turn the tide of the war, because the French and the British are tired by this point, and Americans come in with this new energy, and they're young and they're vivacious and they're full of energy, and they really help morale in the trenches to improve. Congress also passes the Selective Service Act. This is a means of drafting men between the ages of 18 and 45 into the military. And this means that if you are male and you are between those ages, you have to register to vote, or register for the draft, and you have to go to war. There is no way to pay your way out of it or anything of that nature. As this advertisement says, official government notice. Every man between the ages of 18 and 45, both inclusive, except those previously registered, must register for the Selective Service Draft. Exact date of registration to be announced by official proclamation. Be ready. Find out when to register and where to register. Registration will take place in early September. Penalty for failure to register is 1 year imprisonment, and no man can exonerate himself by payment of a fine. Register promptly. What that means is you cannot pay your way out of it, and if you try to avoid it, you can go to jail. Because of this, 2.8 million Americans are drafted into the military. 400,000 of those are black soldiers that are drafted but have to serve in segregated units. Because if you recall, at this point in time, we are a segregated country. African Americans and white people do not eat in the same restaurants. They do not go to the same movie theaters. They do not ride in the same buses in the same seats. And they certainly do not go to school together. So it's because the entire country is segregated, so is the military. And so while they're doing the same job, they just can't do it together. The War Industry Board, or the WIB, was one of those many agencies that are created during World War I. And the purpose of this this board was to create and oversee the production of military supplies. So building ships, building airplanes, building guns, building ammunition, and the WIB encouraged mass production of war equipment, and they set production quotas. So they're using the technique of mass production like we talked about for creating cars, and they're applying it to military use. And they're also saying you must create at least this many. If you make more, great, but you have to make at least this many. So a quota is a limit. In this case, it's a minimum number of supplies that you have to make. And the women are the ones that are really going to do these jobs because the men are all overseas fighting. So women are given a certain amount of guns, for example, that they have to make. And if they make more, that's great, but they have to make this minimum number at least. And we see a lot of propaganda that's put up to try to encourage the people that are still on the home front to get jobs to create these products that are needed for the war. So as you can see, for example, Together We Win. You've got a sailor and a marine and like a shipbuilder. And if we all work together, we'll win the war is the message there. The Food Administration was also created to ration food and encourage Americans to grow victory gardens. And we see this later in World War II as well. And the whole purpose of this is we need to limit the amount of food that people can purchase because we also now have to feed these growing number of people that are joining the military or being drafted. And so the people at home have to conserve food to be able to make sure that the military has enough to feed the soldiers. And Americans are encouraged to grow victory gardens, which are gardens basically in your backyard where you can grow your own vegetables and your own seasonings, different spices and things like that, so that you don't have to buy them. And this then allows for more of those vegetables and things like that to be given to the soldiers. The Fuel Administration was also created to ration coal and oil and to encourage lightless nights. We need gasoline to fuel the Jeeps that are now being used overseas, and the airplanes, and the tanks. And coal and oil are also used for ships. Coal is used in steamships, for example. And the whole point is to ration those necessities for the war effort to allow more of those items to be able to be used for the war overseas. The Committee on Public Information, or the CPI, was created to make propaganda to support the war effort. And again, propaganda is used to encourage certain things. In this case, it's to encourage you to either join the military, plan a victory garden, or as you can see on the side, buy Liberty bonds. And so what these were posters, movies, speeches, newspaper articles that are encouraging drives to raise money for the war. And they're going to do this through the purchase of war bonds. Basically, what a war bond is you will pay a certain amount of money to buy the bond, usually a discount to face value, and after the war, the government would pay you back. It's kind of like a loan. And a lot of times, these were how they paid for the war effort in both world wars. And there was propaganda all around, for example, help crush the menace of the seas in reference to unrestricted submarine warfare that the Germans were using. So they're saying, buy Liberty bonds, which is the same thing as a war bond. So you're giving your money to the government so they can help to fund the war, and then they're promising to pay you back after the war's over. With the military and the economy mobilized for war, the first U.S. troops are sent to Europe in 1918. So we enter the war in 1917, but we've got a lot of work to do before we can actually send troops over there. So in 1918, we send troops to help out, and we finally get to Europe to fight the war. To combat German U-boats, the U.S. uses a convoy system to deliver soldiers and supplies to Europe. Because remember, guys, at this point, we do not have airplanes that can fly from the United States to Great Britain. And so we're going to use a convoy system, which essentially means that we're going to send multiple ships that are traveling together basically for mutual security. And most of the time that would be a lot more safe for them to get across the ocean. The arrival of these fresh American soldiers and these war supplies helped the Allies at a very crucial time when the fighting is really strong, and in all honesty, the French and the British are really losing morale. They're losing hope. U.S. soldiers see their first actual fighting in May of 1918 outside of Paris, and they help resist a German offensive. That means that the Germans are trying to attack Paris, and the U.S. soldiers help push them back away from Paris. And they participate in a counterattack into Germany, which means not only did they help save the capital of France and push the Germans back from the city, they also help go against them and push them back into Germany. Throughout 1918, the American Expeditionary Force, or the AEF, that we talked about previously, led by John J. Pershing, fight with the Allied soldiers to turn the tide of the war. And at this point, American soldiers earn the name of Doughboy. No one's really sure where the name comes from, but that's the nickname for American soldiers in World War I. Many members of the AEF fight really bravely, and one in particular by the name of Alvin York becomes the most decorated soldier of World War I and is awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in France. And you need to remember Alvin York as the most decorated soldier in World War I and also a Medal of Honor recipient, which is one of the highest honors that can be received in action in a war. By October of 1918, Bulgaria, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire had surrendered. So 3 of Germany's biggest allies have given up. And on November 9th, German Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated his throne. And Kaiser Wilhelm is the leader of Germany throughout World War I. And what it means by abdicated, it means he leaves. He gives up his being king. On November 11th of 1918, Germany officially signs an armistice. with the Allies, and World War I officially comes to an end at 11 o'clock in the morning on the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. And this marks the end of what we would call the war to end all wars. An armistice basically just means that both sides agree to stop fighting. They agreed on a certain time, which is why they stopped at 11 o'clock. And they agree on the date, November 11th. So they end at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. And this is very interesting. This is a audio recording of the end, and you can hear the actual end of the war. So let's listen. As we heard, the guns go silent, and then within a minute or two, you can start to hear the birds start chirping again. And it's kind of eerie, but peaceful at the same time. So the U.S. reluctantly enters World War I, but plays only a supportive role in the fighting. But the war changes the United States in ways that could not have been predicted. America only fights for about 8 months, while the rest of the war is 4 years. The United States only has about 7% casualties, unlike about 52% of most of the rest of the Allied powers. But it accelerates America's emergence as a world power. It contributes to the movement of African Americans to northern cities in what we call the Great Migration. It's going to lead to some pretty big impacts in the 1920s. It intensifies anti-immigrant and anti-radical sentiments among mainstream Americans because we see these immigrants that are coming in as the enemy. Because most of the people that were coming in to Ellis Island are from Eastern Europe, and then now we're in a war with Eastern Europe. And it brought over 1 million women into the workforce because America needs people to create all of these guns and weapons and airplanes and tanks and ships. And if the men are over fighting a war, really it's only women that are left to take care of things at home. This is going to bring us to the end of Unit 3, Lesson 4. Thank you for watching. See you back here for Lesson 3.5. Have a great day.